The wealthy woman who was about to become my mother-in-law spent an entire afternoon dressed as someone the world throws away, just to see if I would stop to help her. My name is Anna Miller, and I work at Hope United in Hartford, Connecticut. It's a nonprofit that helps veterans and struggling families find their footing again. The work doesn't pay much, but it taught me something my fiancé's world never could. That dignity isn't measured by the weight of your wallet. That Tuesday afternoon in late October, I had exactly 17 minutes to make it from a JCPenney in downtown Greenwich to the Sterling Mansion on Meadow Lane. I was already cutting it close, already imagining the frost in Beatrice Sterling's voice when I arrived even 30 seconds past the appointed hour of 5 o'clock. She was the kind of woman who considered punctuality a moral virtue and lateness a character flaw. But there was this woman at the register, elderly, hunched inside a coat that had seen too many winters. Her hands shook as she counted bills that wouldn't be enough. The cashier's voice carried that specific blend of boredom and contempt that retail workers reserve for people who waste their time. I should have walked past her. I should have protected my future, my carefully constructed life with David Sterling, the real estate heir who loved me in the particular way rich men love projects they believe they can improve. Instead, I handed over my credit card and paid the $150 she needed. Then I took off the cashmere scarf David had specifically told me to wear, the $700 shield meant to prove I belonged in his world, and I wrapped it around her thin shoulders. That decision cost me everything I thought I wanted. What I didn't know was that it would also save me from a life I was never meant to live. If you want to know how a simple act of kindness can detonate your entire future, stay with me. This story gets complicated fast, and I'll need you to see it through to understand why sometimes the worst thing that can happen to you is actually the best. To make sure you catch every twist, you might want to follow along here, because what happened next changed everything I believed about love, loyalty, and what it really means to pass a test you didn't know you were taking. 6 months before that afternoon at JCPenney, I thought I had won some kind of lottery. David Sterling walked into Hope United looking for a tax write-off and walked out with my phone number. He was handsome in that specific way wealthy men are when they spend their mornings with personal trainers and their afternoons in tailored suits. More than that, he seemed genuinely interested in what I did, asking questions about the families we served, nodding thoughtfully when I explained how veteran homelessness was a systemic failure, not a personal one. Our third date was at a restaurant where the menu didn't list prices. He ordered for both of us without asking what I wanted, but I told myself it was confidence, not control. When he reached across the table and said I was different from the women in his circle, I felt chosen. Special. Like I had something they didn't. Something real and authentic that money couldn't buy. The engagement happened fast. 4 months in, he took me to Martha's Vineyard for a weekend. And on the last night, under a sky so clear you could see every star, he asked me to marry him. The ring was a family heirloom, 3 carats of emerald-cut diamond that felt heavy on my finger in ways that had nothing to do with its weight. When I called my sister in Ohio to tell her, she asked one question that I brushed off too quickly. Does he make you happy? Or does he make you feel safe? I told her both. But I knew even then that safety and happiness aren't always the same thing. Beatrice Sterling didn't attend our engagement dinner. She sent a note instead, written on cream cardstock in perfect calligraphy, congratulating her son and informing us that we would be expected for dinner the following month. David read it and went pale. He told me his mother was exacting, that she had opinions about everything, and that the women who married into the Sterling family either earned her respect or spent decades being quietly demolished by her disapproval. I started preparing for that dinner the way someone might prepare for a deposition. David gave me reading materials, articles about the Sterling real estate empire, profiles of Beatrice's philanthropic work, which focused exclusively on arts institutions and historic preservation. Nothing messy, nothing that dealt with actual poverty. When I mentioned that Hope United was planning a fundraiser for winter housing assistance, David suggested I maybe not bring that up. His mother thought charity was for people who couldn't figure out how to succeed on their own. That's when the changes started. Small at first. He mentioned that my work clothes looked tired, so he took me shopping and picked out outfits that made me look like I was auditioning for a role in a museum. He asked if I'd considered updating my haircut, maybe something sleeker, more polished. He started correcting the way I held my fork at dinner, telling me his mother would notice things like that. Each adjustment felt minor on its own, but together they formed a picture. The woman I wasn't quite enough. She needed to be sanded down, reshaped, made acceptable. The day before the dinner, I worked a double shift at Hope United. A retired Marine named Robert Patterson had been evicted from his apartment because his disability check was delayed in some bureaucratic nightmare. He was living in his car with his dog, a German Shepherd mix named Scout, who was the only family he had left. I spent 8 hours making phone calls, pulling together emergency funds, finding him temporary housing. When I got home that night, my feet aching and my heart heavy with the weight of how broken the system was, David looked at me like I had done something personally offensive. He told me I couldn't keep burning myself out for people who would never appreciate it. He said I needed to start thinking about my future, about our future, about the kind of life we were building together. He said his mother expected me to eventually transition away from Hope United once we were married, to focus on running our household, and maybe sitting on some nonprofit boards, where I could be useful without getting my hands quite so dirty. I remember standing in our apartment, looking at this man I was supposed to marry, and feeling a cold recognition settle in my chest. This wasn't about building a life together. This was about renovation. He was trying to turn me into someone his mother could tolerate, someone who fit neatly into the Sterling family portrait without disrupting its carefully composed lines. But I told myself it was just nerves. That once the dinner was over, once I proved I could hold my own with Beatrice, everything would relax. I would be allowed to be myself again. I laid out the blue dress he had selected, the Italian heels that made my feet bleed, and that cashmere scarf he said would show I understood quality. I set 3 alarms to make sure I wouldn't be late. What I didn't know was that Beatrice Sterling had her own plans for that evening. She had spent years watching women parade through her son's life, each one more eager than the last to trade their identity for access to the Sterling fortune. She had perfected the art of exposing them, of creating situations where their true nature would reveal itself. The dinner invitation was just the stage. The real test would happen long before I ever sat down at her table, and I was about to fail it in exactly the right way. The morning of the dinner, I woke up with the kind of anxiety that sits on your chest like a weight. David was already up, reviewing his presentation notes for a development deal in Stamford. He glanced at me over his coffee and reminded me, almost casually, that I needed to be perfect today. Not good. Perfect. His mother had a way of finding the weak spots in people, and if I gave her any opening, she would use it to convince him I wasn't suitable for the family. I asked him what happened if I wasn't perfect. He looked at me like I had asked something absurd. He said failure wasn't an option we were considering. Hope United called me at 9 a.m. Robert Patterson, the veteran I had helped the day before, had been rushed to the hospital with pneumonia. The temporary housing had fallen through because of a clerical error, and he had spent another night in his car in 40-degree weather. His daughter was on her way from Syracuse, but someone needed to handle Scout and make sure Robert's belongings were secure. My supervisor asked if I could come in for a few hours. David stood in the doorway of our bedroom while I changed into work clothes. He asked if I was seriously considering going to the office today. I told him it would only be until noon, that I would have plenty of time to get ready. He suggested I let someone else handle it, that I was always making myself indispensable to people who would forget my name the moment I stopped being useful. I went anyway. Some things matter more than approval. By the time I left Hope United, it was 3:30. I had exactly 90 minutes to get home, shower, transform myself into the woman David needed me to be, and make it to Greenwich. I took the train, watching the landscape change from the tired brick buildings of Hartford to the manicured estates of Fairfield County. Somewhere around Westport, I realized I had forgotten the white lilies David told me to bring. His mother loved white lilies. Not bringing them would be interpreted as thoughtlessness, or worse, defiance. I got off at Greenwich Station and found a florist that was closing early. The owner took pity on me and sold me the last bouquet they had, but the stems were wrapped in plain cellophane. David would notice. His mother would definitely notice. I walked quickly toward the mansion, my heels clicking on the sidewalk, my mind calculating whether I had time to find better wrapping. That's when I saw the JCPenney. The store was one of those anchor locations that still existed in older downtown areas, a remnant from when department stores were where everyone shopped. I ducked inside, thinking I could grab a gift bag or some tissue paper, something to make the lilies look more intentional. The lighting was harsh. The air smelled like synthetic lavender, and I had to navigate around displays of discounted kitchen appliances. The registers were near the front. I grabbed a silver gift bag and was heading toward checkout when I heard the commotion. An elderly woman stood at the counter with her items spread out in front of her. A winter coat that was on clearance, some thermal underwear, thick socks, a cheap but warm scarf, the kind of practical purchases someone makes when they're trying to survive winter on a fixed income. The cashier was a young man who looked like he had checked out emotionally from his job months ago. He was telling her loudly that her card had been declined, and could she please step aside so he could help the other customers. The line behind her was growing. People were checking their phones, sighing, radiating that particular impatience that comes from feeling their time is being wasted by someone else's poverty. The woman was trying to decide what to put back. Her hands were shaking badly enough that she dropped a $20 bill, and when she bent to pick it up, I saw how thin she was beneath that old coat. I checked my phone. 4:15. If I left right then, I would arrive at the Sterling Mansion at 4:58, assuming no traffic. Acceptable by anyone's standards except Beatrice's. But if I stopped to help, if I took even 5 minutes to sort this out, I would be late. And lateness, David had made very clear, would be unforgivable. The woman looked up at me. Her eyes were pale blue, almost colorless, and there was something in them that I recognized from my work. Not hopelessness exactly, more like resignation. The exhaustion that comes from a lifetime of being invisible to people who had the power to see you. Every rational part of my brain said to walk away. This wasn't my problem. I had helped Robert Patterson that morning. I had given everything I had to give that day. I had earned the right to protect myself, to think about my own future, to not derail my entire life over a stranger's credit card decline. But I thought about what Robert had said to me that morning in the hospital, his voice rough from pneumonia and shame. He told me the worst part of needing help wasn't the asking. It was the knowing that most people would look right through you, like you were made of glass. He said I was one of the few people who ever really saw him. I stepped forward and handed my card to the cashier. I told him to run the whole purchase, that I would cover whatever she needed. The woman turned to me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Shock, maybe, or something else. Something that looked almost like evaluation. She told me she couldn't possibly accept, that it was too much money, that she didn't know how she would ever repay me. I told her the truth, that I worked with people every day who deserved better than what they got, and if I could do this one small thing to make her life easier, it wasn't charity. It was just being human. The cashier ran my card. The total came to $152. I grabbed my gift bag and started to leave. But when I looked back, the woman was still standing there, holding her purchases, and she was shivering despite the store's heating. The coat she had just bought was in a bag. The one she wore looked like it had maybe one more winter left in it before it fell apart completely. I unwound the cashmere scarf from around my neck. David's voice echoed in my head, reminding me that his mother would notice I wasn't wearing it, that every detail mattered today. But the woman in front of me was trembling, and I had been warm all day, and sometimes you just have to choose what kind of person you are in the moment that counts. I wrapped the scarf around her shoulders and told her to keep it, that Connecticut autumns were brutal, and nobody should have to face them without something soft to hold on to. She touched the fabric like it was made of something precious, which I suppose it was, though not in the way David meant. She looked at me for a long moment, and then she said something strange. She said that people didn't stop to notice each other anymore, that kindness had become rare enough to be remarkable. And then she called me by name. Anna Miller. Like she knew exactly who I was. I didn't have time to ask how. I was already late. I ran. I made it to the Sterling mansion at 5:17. David was waiting in the circular driveway, and the look on his face made my stomach drop. He wasn't just angry. He looked genuinely frightened, and that scared me more than anything else. I had never seen him afraid of his mother before. Intimidated, yes. Desperate to please her, absolutely. But this was different. This was the face of someone who believed they were about to watch their entire future collapse. He grabbed my arm the moment I stepped out of the Uber and pulled me toward the side entrance, his voice low and sharp. He said, 17 minutes might not seem like much to me, but to his mother, it was an announcement that I didn't respect her time, her home, or her authority. He said she had been sitting at the table since 4:55, waiting, and that every minute that passed was another mark against me that I would never be able to erase. I tried to explain about the woman at the store, about how I couldn't just walk away from someone who needed help. He cut me off. He said that was exactly the problem with me, that I couldn't distinguish between being compassionate and being self-destructive. He said his mother would see my lateness as evidence that I wasn't ready to be part of a family that valued discipline and excellence. Then he noticed the scarf was missing. He actually stopped walking and stared at my neck like I had shown up naked. He asked where it was, his voice climbing an octave. I told him I gave it to someone who was cold. He repeated my words back to me slowly, like he was trying to make sense of a foreign language. I gave a $700 cashmere scarf to a stranger, in a JCPenney, on the most important day of our relationship. I watched something shift in his face, not anger anymore, something closer to despair. He told me I had no idea what I had just done, that his mother would interpret this as contempt, that I might as well have spit in her face. I asked him if he really thought a scarf mattered that much. He looked at me like I was impossibly naive. He said everything mattered to Beatrice Sterling. Everything was a test. We entered through the main door because there was no point in trying to be subtle anymore. The foyer was exactly what I expected. Marble floors, a chandelier that probably cost more than most people's houses, art on the walls that belonged in museums. A woman who I assumed was the housekeeper took my coat without making eye contact. David kept his hand on my lower back, guiding me forward, and I could feel his fingers digging in hard enough to leave marks. The dining room was at the end of a long hallway. I could hear the silence before we even entered, that particular quality of quiet that comes from someone waiting with perfect patience for you to realize how badly you've failed. Beatrice Sterling sat at the head of a table that could have seated 20 people. She was smaller than I expected, which somehow made her more intimidating. Her hair was silver and pulled back in a style that looked effortless, but probably required professional help. She wore a dove gray dress that was clearly expensive but understated, and her only jewelry was a pair of pearl earrings that looked like they predated World War II. But what made my heart stop was what was draped over the back of her chair. My scarf. The blue cashmere scarf I had wrapped around the elderly woman's shoulders 40 minutes ago. I stood there, frozen, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. There had to be an explanation. Maybe it was a different scarf. Maybe the Sterling family bought their accessories in bulk. Maybe I was hallucinating from stress and lack of food because I had been too nervous to eat all day. David didn't seem to notice. He was too busy launching into what sounded like a prepared apology, explaining that I had been held up by an emergency at work, that I took my responsibilities very seriously, perhaps too seriously, and that he hoped his mother would forgive the disruption to her schedule. Beatrice held up one hand, and he stopped talking immediately. She looked at me with an expression I couldn't read. Not quite hostile, but not warm either. Evaluating. Like I was a painting she was considering purchasing and couldn't decide if it was worth the investment. She told us to sit. David practically shoved me into the chair across from his mother and took the seat beside me. A different staff member appeared and began serving the first course. Some kind of soup that smelled like truffle, and probably cost more per bowl than I made in a day. Nobody spoke. The only sounds were silver spoons against china and the ticking of an antique clock somewhere in the house. Finally, Beatrice set down her spoon and looked directly at me. She said she had heard a great deal about me from David, that he spoke of me as if I were some kind of rare discovery he had made among the common people. She said it with such precise diction that it took me a moment to recognize it as an insult. I told her I was looking forward to getting to know her, that David had explained how important family was to the Sterlings. She made a small noise that might have been amusement. She said family was important to everyone. What mattered was whether people understood what family required. Sacrifice. Loyalty. The ability to put collective interests above personal feelings. David jumped in to assure her that I understood all of this, that I came from humble beginnings, but had worked hard to better myself, that I was exactly the kind of woman who would honor the Sterling name. I felt him kick my foot under the table, a signal to agree, to play along, to be the person he needed me to be. But I kept staring at that scarf on her chair, at the small pulled thread near the hem that I had noticed that morning when David handed it to me, at the exact pattern of blue that had been around my own neck just an hour ago. Beatrice followed my gaze. She reached back without looking and touched the scarf with one finger, a gesture so casual it had to be deliberate. Then she asked me a question that made the room tilt. She asked me what I thought about people who were late to important engagements, whether I believed punctuality was a meaningful measure of character, or just an arbitrary social convention that people used to judge each other. I could feel David's panic radiating off him in waves. This was a trap. Every possible answer was wrong. If I defended my lateness, I was disrespectful. If I apologized too much, I was weak. If I tried to explain, I would sound like I was making excuses. I looked at Beatrice Sterling, at this woman who held my future in her perfectly manicured hands, and I decided to tell her the truth. I told her that I thought being on time was important when you had the luxury of controlling your schedule, but that sometimes life presented you with choices between being punctual and being decent, and that I would rather be the kind of person who stopped to help someone than the kind who stepped over them to arrive on time. The silence that followed was so complete I could hear my own heartbeat. David had stopped breathing beside me. Beatrice stared at me with those cold eyes, and I waited for her to end me, to tell David I was exactly as unsuitable as she had suspected, to send me back to Hartford and my nonprofit job and my small apartment where I belonged. Instead, she smiled. It was not a warm smile, but it was something. She said dinner would be interesting. The soup course passed in a fog of tension so thick I could barely swallow. David attempted several times to steer the conversation toward safe topics. The unseasonably warm fall, a new development project in Darien, mutual acquaintances who had recently gotten married or divorced, or done something else worth discussing among people who considered gossip a form of networking. Beatrice responded to each attempt with minimal engagement, her attention never fully leaving me. She asked about my background, not where I went to school or what my parents did for a living, but deeper questions that felt designed to expose something. She wanted to know why I chose to work in nonprofits when I could have pursued more lucrative careers. I told her I didn't see financial security as the ultimate measure of a life well lived. She asked if I was implying that people who pursued wealth were somehow morally inferior. I said no, just that different people found meaning in different places. David kept trying to soften my answers, to add context that would make me sound less judgmental, but Beatrice waved him off each time. She said she wanted to hear from me directly, without translation. The second course arrived, duck breast with a cherry reduction that was plated like art. I had never eaten duck before. I watched Beatrice cut into hers and tried to copy her technique, but I could feel myself failing at some unspoken etiquette test. David's jaw was clenched so tight I thought his teeth might crack. Beatrice asked about my family. I told her my father worked in manufacturing before the plant closed, that my mother cleaned houses, that I had a younger sister who taught elementary school in Cincinnati. I said it plainly, without shame, but also without pretending it was something other than what it was. Working-class people doing their best in an economy that had moved past them. She asked if they were proud of me. I said they were worried about me, actually. That they thought marrying into wealth would change me into someone they wouldn't recognize. That my mother had asked me during our last phone call if I was happy or just comfortable, and I hadn't been able to answer her. I don't know why I said that. It just came out. This truth I hadn't even fully admitted to myself. David's hand found my knee under the table and squeezed hard enough to hurt. A warning. A plea. An accusation. Beatrice set down her fork and studied me with an intensity that made me feel transparent. She said her son had a habit of bringing home women who were very good at pretending to be what they thought he wanted. She said most of them lasted through 3 or 4 dinners before the mask slipped, and she saw the calculation underneath. She said the ones who married into wealthy families without genuinely understanding what they were signing up for ended up bitter and divorced within 5 years. David started to protest that we were different, that what we had was real. Beatrice told him she was speaking to me, not to him. She wanted to know if I understood what his life actually looked like. The obligations, the expectations, the way every decision would be scrutinized by a community that had known the Sterling family for 4 generations and would never truly accept an outsider. I told her I understood that I would always be the woman from Hartford who worked with veterans. That no matter what I wore or how I spoke or how perfectly I executed dinner party etiquette, there would always be people who saw me as David's charity project. I told her I had made peace with that, or at least I thought I had. She asked what changed. Why I thought I had made peace with it if I now seemed uncertain. I looked at her, this woman who had probably never been uncertain about anything in her entire life, and I told her the truth. I said I wasn't sure anymore if being loved meant being changed, or if real love was supposed to let you stay who you are. Something flickered across Beatrice's face. Not sympathy, exactly. Maybe recognition. She picked up her wine glass and took a long sip before responding. She said that was actually an intelligent question, and that most people never thought to ask it until they were already trapped in marriages that answered it for them. David excused himself then, claiming he needed to check on the wine selection for the next course. It was transparently an excuse to escape, to not have to watch his mother dissect me any further. Beatrice and I sat alone at opposite ends of that massive table, and the weight of the silence felt different now. Less hostile, more appraising. She asked about my work at Hope United, not in the dismissive way David had described, but with genuine curiosity. She wanted to know what I actually did there, what made someone decide to dedicate their life to helping people who society had essentially written off. I told her about Robert Patterson, about how he had served 3 tours in Afghanistan and came home to a country that thanked him for his service, but couldn't find him stable housing. I told her about the families I worked with who were one medical emergency away from homelessness, the single mothers working 3 jobs who still couldn't make rent, the elderly people choosing between medication and food. Beatrice listened without interrupting. When I finished, she asked if I thought I was actually making a difference or just making myself feel better about a system I couldn't change. It was the kind of question that should have made me defensive, but something about the way she asked it suggested she genuinely wanted to know the answer. I told her I thought both things could be true, that I was probably making myself feel better, but that the people I helped didn't care about my motivations as long as they got housed or fed or connected to services they needed. I said I had made peace with being someone who couldn't fix everything, but refused to fix nothing. She nodded slowly, like I had confirmed something she suspected. Then she asked me the question that made everything click into place. She asked what I had done that afternoon. before I arrived at the mansion. She wanted to know, specifically, if anything unusual had happened. My heart started pounding. I looked at the scarf still draped over her chair, at the pulled thread catching the light from the chandelier. I thought about the woman in JCPenney, about her pale blue eyes and the way she had known my name. I told Beatrice I had helped someone at a store who couldn't afford her purchases, that I had paid for her items and given her my scarf because she was cold. I said it matter-of-factly, like it was the kind of thing anyone would do, even though I knew it wasn't. I knew most people would have walked past her. I had almost walked past her myself. Beatrice asked how much I had spent. I told her the total. She asked why I did it when I was already late, when I knew it would jeopardize my standing with her. I told her because the woman needed help more than I needed approval. She stood up from her chair, a movement so sudden and decisive that I thought she was about to throw me out. Instead, she walked the length of the table toward me, carrying the scarf in her hands. She stopped directly in front of me and held it up between us like evidence in a trial. She told me she had been watching me since the moment David mentioned my name, that she had researched me, interviewed people who knew me, and concluded that I was either extraordinarily genuine or extraordinarily good at faking it. She said she needed to know which one was true before she allowed her son to make what could be the biggest mistake of his life. David returned then, carrying a bottle of wine and wearing a smile that looked painful. He saw his mother standing over me with the scarf and went pale. He started apologizing again, saying he had told me how important it was to wear it, that my giving it away was not a reflection of any disrespect toward the family. Beatrice held up her hand, and he stopped talking. She looked at me for a long moment, and I saw something in her expression I hadn't seen before. It almost looked like respect. She said she had one more question for me. She wanted to know if I had recognized the woman in the store, if I had any idea who she was when I stopped to help her. I told her no, that she was just someone who needed help, that I never asked her name. Beatrice smiled then, a real smile that reached her eyes and made her look 20 years younger. She turned to David and told him to sit down. She said she had something to tell us both, and that he especially was going to want to hear this sitting down. The room felt like it was tilting. I gripped the edge of the table and waited for whatever truth was about to detonate my life. Beatrice sat back down in her chair, but this time she positioned herself between David and me, forming a triangle at one end of the massive table. She poured herself more wine with steady hands and took her time, making us wait. David was gripping his fork like it might be a weapon he needed. I was trying to remember how to breathe. She told us she had been testing women for 15 years, ever since David's father died and she realized her son had inherited wealth, but not the judgment to protect it. She said she had watched 3 serious relationships disintegrate because the women involved revealed themselves to be interested in the sterling name more than the sterling son. They had been polite at dinners, charming at charity galas, perfect on paper, but they failed when it actually mattered. David said he didn't know what she was talking about. His voice had an edge of defensiveness that made him sound younger than he was. He reminded her that his last girlfriend, Charlotte, had come from an equally prominent family, that she had been everything his mother claimed to want in a daughter-in-law, educated, sophisticated, from the right background. Beatrice laughed, but there was no warmth in it. She said Charlotte had been the worst of them all. She asked David if he remembered the charity auction where Charlotte had bid $30,000 on a sculpture, not because she appreciated art, but because she wanted to be photographed for the society pages. She asked if he remembered finding out later that Charlotte had expected him to reimburse her, that she had seen the bid as an investment in her own image rather than a contribution to the cause. David went quiet. I had never heard about Charlotte. He had mentioned previous relationships in vague terms, but never with details, never with names. Now I understood why. Beatrice turned her attention to me. She said that when David first told her about me, she was skeptical. A woman who worked at a nonprofit, who came from a modest background, who claimed to care more about helping people than advancing her own position. It sounded too perfect. Too much like something someone would fabricate if they were smart enough to realize that a different approach might work where traditional social climbing had failed. I asked her if she thought I was running some kind of long con, that I had spent years working an underpaid job just on the off chance I might meet a wealthy man. She said people had done stranger things for money, that the world was full of patient predators. David slammed his hand on the table, making the crystal glasses rattle. He told his mother she was being insulting, that she had no right to question my character like this, that I had done nothing but try to meet her impossible standards. Beatrice looked at him with something between pity and contempt. She said his defense of me would be more convincing if he hadn't spent the last 6 months trying to sand off everything that made me different from the women she had already rejected. That stopped him cold. She detailed every way he had tried to change me. The clothes, the haircut, the suggestions about leaving Hope United, the corrections to my table manners, the coaching before social events. She said she had been watching all of it through his own reports, through the things he proudly told her about how he was helping me become more refined. She asked him if it had ever occurred to him that someone who needed that much changing might not be the problem, that maybe he was dating someone he didn't actually like very much. He just liked the idea of improving her. David looked stricken. He started to argue, but the words died in his throat. I watched him realize something about himself that he had been avoiding, and I felt an unexpected rush of sadness for him. He wasn't malicious. He was just trying to make me fit into a space that was never designed for someone like me. Beatrice continued. She said she needed to know if I was genuine, or just better at playing the game than her son's previous girlfriends. So she designed a test. Not here, at the mansion where I would be on guard and performing, but out in the world, where I wouldn't have time to calculate the right response. My mouth went dry. I looked again at the scarf on her chair. She said she had spent weeks preparing. She researched places I might go, times I might be vulnerable to manipulation or observation. She hired a private investigator who confirmed that I really did work the long hours I claimed at Hope United, that I really did live in a modest apartment despite having access to David's money, that there was no evidence I was secretly funneling resources or building a case for some future divorce settlement. David interrupted to say this was insane, that she had hired someone to investigate me like I was a criminal. Beatrice said she had hired someone to protect her family's interests, which was her right and her responsibility. She said if he wasn't prepared to be as careful with their legacy as she was, then perhaps he wasn't ready to inherit it. The threat hung in the air like smoke. David shut his mouth. Beatrice turned back to me. She said the investigator's report was mostly positive but ultimately inconclusive. Anyone could maintain a performance for 6 months if the payoff was large enough. What she needed was to see me in a moment where I had to choose between self-interest and something else. A moment where there was a cost to being kind, where helping someone would directly harm my own prospects. She told me she had created that moment. She had gone to that JCPenney wearing her oldest clothes, carrying a worn wallet, playing the part of someone the world had forgotten. She had stood at that register and waited to see what I would do. She said 3 other people had walked past her before I arrived. Young, well-dressed people who had glanced at her situation and kept moving. She had been prepared for me to do the same thing. In fact, she had expected it. She had thought I would take one look at the time, calculate the cost of being late to meet her, and prioritize my own future. But I hadn't. I had stopped. I had paid. And then, impossibly, I had given her the exact scarf David had told me to wear. The symbol of my understanding of their world, handed over to someone who appeared to have nothing. Beatrice said that was when she knew. David was staring at his mother like she had revealed herself to be a stranger. He asked how she could do something so manipulative, so calculated. She told him calmly that manipulation required dishonesty. She had simply removed the obstacle of her wealth to see if I would respond to need rather than opportunity. She said it was the oldest test in the world. Would you help someone if there was nothing in it for you? I found my voice finally. I asked her what she would have done if I hadn't helped, if I had walked past her like those other 3 people. She met my eyes steadily. She said she would have told David I wasn't suitable for the family, that she would have made his life difficult enough that he would have eventually broken our engagement. She said it with no apology, no guilt, just fact. Then she did something that caught me completely off guard. She apologized to me. She said she was sorry for testing me like that, but that she wasn't sorry for needing to know. She said her son had proven himself incapable of choosing partners based on character, and that if she didn't intervene, he would end up married to someone who would drain the sterling resources and leave him broken when it served her interests. She said I had passed a test I didn't know I was taking, that I had revealed myself to be exactly who I claimed to be, someone who couldn't walk past suffering, even when it cost me something I wanted. Then she stood up and walked back to her chair. She picked up the scarf and held it for a moment, before folding it carefully and setting it on the table between us. She said the test wasn't completely over, because now she needed to know something else. She needed to know what I was going to do with this information, whether I could forgive David for trying to change me, whether I could accept being married into a family where I would always be watched, always be measured, always be required to prove myself worthy, whether the version of me that stopped in that JCPenney could survive in the world David was offering. She said I had 24 hours to decide, that I should go home and think carefully about what I wanted my life to look like, that if I chose to walk away, she would respect that decision and make sure David didn't try to change my mind. But she also said that if I chose to stay, I would have an ally in her, that she would defend me against the people in their circle who would try to dismiss me, that she had been looking for someone real for 15 years, and if I was willing to stay myself, she would make sure I had the space to do it. David finally spoke. His voice was small, confused. He asked what he was supposed to do while I made this decision. Beatrice looked at him with something that might have been disappointment. She told him he needed to decide something too. He needed to figure out if he actually wanted to marry me, or if he wanted to marry his improved version of me, because if it was the latter, then I should definitely walk away. The dinner ended shortly after that. No dessert, no coffee, no pretense that we were going to continue acting like this was a normal family meal. David drove me back to Hartford in silence. When he dropped me off at my apartment, he tried to apologize, but I told him I needed time to think. I spent that night staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment from the last 6 months, trying to figure out if what David and I had was love, or just proximity and potential, trying to imagine what my life would look like if I stayed versus if I left. But more than anything, I kept thinking about Beatrice's face when she revealed herself, the calculation in it, the absolute certainty that testing people like laboratory subjects was an acceptable way to protect your family. And I kept thinking about what it meant that I had passed. I called in sick to Hope United the next morning, which I almost never did. My supervisor sounded concerned and asked if I was okay. I told her I was dealing with a family situation, which was technically true if you counted the potential dissolution of my engagement as a family situation. She told me to take whatever time I needed, that Robert Patterson was recovering well, and had asked about me, which made me feel simultaneously better and worse about everything. David called 17 times. I didn't answer. He left voicemails that progressed from apologetic to frustrated, to something that sounded like genuine fear. In the last one, he said his mother had summoned him to the mansion and told him that regardless of what I decided, he needed to spend the day thinking seriously about who he had become. He said it like it was the most devastating thing anyone had ever said to him. I spent the morning walking. Hartford in late October is beautiful in a melancholy way. All those New England trees showing off their deaths in colors that make you feel things you don't have words for. I walked past Hope United and saw through the windows that someone was handling intake, that the work continued, whether I was there or not. I walked past the apartment David and I had looked at together, the one with the view of Bushnell Park that we were planning to move into after the wedding. I tried to imagine myself living there, hosting dinner parties, managing a household, becoming the woman Beatrice had described, watched, measured, required to prove herself worthy. Then I walked to the library and sat in the reading room where I used to study when I was in college, before I met David, before I knew that life could offer me anything beyond what I could build with my own hands. I thought about who I had been back then. Hungry, determined, certain that the work I did mattered even if it didn't pay well. Certain that the measure of a life was what you gave, not what you accumulated. That woman felt very far away now, but I could still remember her. I went home and called my mother. She was at work, cleaning a doctor's house in Cincinnati, but she answered anyway because I never called in the middle of the day unless something was wrong. I told her everything. The test, the scarf, Beatrice's revelation, David's attempts to change me. When I finished, there was a long silence on the other end. Then my mother said something I didn't expect. She said she had met my father when she was cleaning rooms at the motel where he worked maintenance. That she had been ashamed to bring him home to her parents because he didn't have a college degree, because he worked with his hands, because he wasn't what they had envisioned for her. She said she spent the first year of their relationship trying to improve him, suggesting night classes, criticizing his grammar, buying him clothes that looked more professional. She said it almost destroyed them. That he finally sat her down and told her he was fine being who he was, and if she needed him to be someone else, then maybe she should find someone else. She said it was the most terrifying and important conversation of her life, because it forced her to ask herself whether she loved him or loved the idea of fixing him. I asked her what she decided. She laughed. She said obviously she decided she loved him, because here they were 40 years later. But she said the only reason it worked was because she stopped trying to change him and started appreciating what he actually was. Loyal, kind, steady, real. The kind of man who showed up every day and did his best even when life gave him nothing but problems. She asked me if I loved David. I told her I didn't know anymore. That I loved the man he was when we first met, when he seemed interested in my work and respectful of my choices. But I didn't know if that man still existed, or if he had ever existed at all. She said that was my answer right there. That if I had to qualify my love with conditions about the past or the future, it probably wasn't the kind of love you build a marriage on. I thanked her and hung up. Then, I sat on my bed and cried for 20 minutes, not because I was sad, but because I had known the answer since the dinner and hadn't wanted to admit it. David showed up at my apartment at 6 that evening. He looked terrible. Unshaven, wearing sweatpants, his eyes red like he hadn't slept. He asked if we could talk. I let him in. He sat on my couch and put his head in his hands. He said his mother had spent the day explaining all the ways he had failed me, that he had treated me like a renovation project instead of a partner, that he had been so focused on making me fit into his world that he never stopped to ask if his world was worth fitting into. He said he had been thinking about why he did that. He thought maybe it was because he was afraid of introducing someone too different to his family, afraid they would reject me and, by extension, reject his judgment. He said he realized that fear had made him cruel, that he had demanded I sacrifice parts of myself to make his life easier. Then he asked me if I still wanted to marry him. I took a breath and told him the truth. I said I wanted to marry someone who saw me clearly and wanted exactly that person. Not a better version, not an improved model, just me as I actually was. I said I didn't think he could be that person for me, and I didn't think I could be what he needed either. I told him I wasn't angry with him, that I understood he had been shaped by his mother's expectations the same way I had been shaped by mine, that we were both doing our best to figure out how to live in a world that demanded we be things we weren't. But I told him I couldn't do it anymore, that I needed to go back to being the woman who stopped to help strangers even when it cost her something. That woman couldn't survive being married to him. He started crying. Real tears, the kind men aren't supposed to show. He said he understood, but that it didn't make it hurt less. He said his mother was right about him, that he had been choosing women he didn't actually like because he wanted the challenge of improving them. He said maybe that meant he wasn't ready to be married to anyone. We sat in silence for a while. Then he took off my engagement ring, which I had forgotten I was still wearing, and set it gently on my coffee table. He said the ring had been his grandmother's, but that he wanted me to keep it anyway. Not to sell, but because I had earned it by being honest when honesty was hard. I told him I couldn't keep it, that it belonged in his family. He said I was more honorable than anyone in his family, and if I didn't take the ring, he would donate it to Hope United's next fundraiser. So I kept it, though I knew I would probably end up giving it back eventually. Before he left, he turned at the door and said something I didn't expect. He said his mother wanted to see me, that she had invited me to lunch the following week, just the two of us. He said I didn't have to go, but that she specifically asked him to tell me. She meant what she said about being an ally. I told him I would think about it. He nodded and left. And I watched through my window as he got into his car and sat there for 5 minutes before driving away. The apartment felt very quiet after he was gone. I looked at the ring on my coffee table, at all the possibilities it represented that I had just closed the door on. Part of me wondered if I had made a terrible mistake, if I would regret walking away from financial security and social position, and a life that most people would consider winning. But then I thought about that woman in the JCPenney, about how her hands shook when she couldn't pay for her purchases, about how she looked at me when I wrapped the scarf around her shoulders, about how she knew my name. Beatrice had tested me, but she had also revealed something about herself in the process. She had wanted to know if I was real because she was surrounded by people who weren't. She had spent years watching her son choose performances over people. She was ruthless and calculating, but she was also desperately lonely in her fortress of wealth and standards. I called her the next day and accepted the lunch invitation. I didn't know if we could actually be friends. I didn't know if I wanted to be friends with someone who manipulated people as casually as she manipulated markets. But I knew I wanted to understand her better, to figure out what it meant that she had tested me and decided I passed. And maybe, on some level, I wanted to test her back. The lunch was at a restaurant in West Hartford that didn't look like much from the outside, but turned out to be the kind of place where they didn't give you a menu because the chef decided what you would eat based on what was best that day. Beatrice was already seated when I arrived, wearing a charcoal suit that probably cost more than my monthly rent. She stood when she saw me, which surprised me, and gestured to the chair across from her. She didn't waste time on small talk. She asked me how I was handling the breakup. I told her the truth, that it hurt less than I expected because I had been preparing for it longer than I admitted to myself. She nodded like that made perfect sense. She said most people knew when relationships were wrong long before they admitted it, but that it took courage to act on that knowledge when doing so meant losing something you had invested in. Then she did something I didn't expect. She apologized again for the test. Not for doing it, but for not considering how it would feel to be manipulated even with good intentions. She said she had spent so long protecting her family's interests that she had stopped thinking about whether her methods were kind, only whether they were effective. I asked her if she had ever failed one of her own tests, if she had ever been the person who walked past someone in need because stopping would cost her something she wanted. She was quiet for a long moment, and I could see her deciding whether to tell me the truth. She said yes. When she was younger, before she married into the Sterling family, she had seen a woman being harassed on a subway platform in New York. She had been on her way to a job interview, the kind of opportunity that could change her life. She was wearing her best clothes, carrying a leather portfolio she had saved for months to buy. The woman being harassed was screaming for help, and other people were looking away, that particular kind of deliberate blindness that lets terrible things happen. Beatrice said she looked away too. She got on her train and went to her interview and got the job that eventually led to meeting her husband. She said she had spent 40 years telling herself it was the practical choice, the smart choice, that one woman couldn't stop a dangerous situation. that she would have just put herself at risk without helping anyone. But she said she thought about that woman every time someone asked her what her values were, every time she gave a speech about civic duty or community responsibility, every time she looked at herself in the mirror and pretended she was someone who always did the right thing. She said watching me stop in that JCPenney had been devastating in a way I couldn't understand, because it showed her what she might have been if she had made different choices, if she had prioritized being good over being successful. I told her it was never too late to become that person. She laughed, but there was pain in it. She said at her age, with her reputation, with the life she had built, it kind of was. But she said she could at least make sure she supported people who still had the chance to be better than she was. That's when she told me she was donating $500,000 to Hope United. She said half of it was unrestricted funding we could use however we needed, and half was designated specifically for veteran housing services. She said it was partly because the work mattered, and partly because funding my organization was the closest she could come to rewarding me for passing her test, without it feeling like a transaction. I sat there with tears running down my face, thinking about how many families we could help with that money, how many people like Robert Patterson could get stable housing and medical care and maybe a chance to rebuild their lives. I thanked her, but the words felt inadequate. She asked me to do something in return, not as a condition of the donation, but as a favor. She asked me to have lunch with her once a month. She said she had spent too long surrounding herself with people who told her what she wanted to hear, and she needed someone in her life who would tell her the truth, even when it was uncomfortable. Over the next 6 months, those lunches became the strangest friendship I had ever had. Beatrice introduced me to people in her social circle who actually cared about making a difference, not just writing checks to look good. She helped me navigate the world of major donors and taught me how to ask for money without feeling like I was begging. She used her influence to open doors I didn't even know existed. But more than that, she asked me questions that made me think harder about my own choices. She pushed back when I was being naive about politics or economics. She challenged me to consider how systems could be changed from the inside instead of just treating symptoms. She made me better at my job by refusing to let me settle for feeling good instead of doing good. David moved to Boston 6 months after we broke up. Beatrice told me he had started therapy and was trying to figure out who he was without the weight of family expectations crushing him. She said he was dating someone who worked in public health, someone who apparently had no patience for his attempts to improve her. She said it with approval. The ring ended up going back to the Sterling family eventually. I gave it to Beatrice at one of our lunches and told her to give it to David when he was ready to propose to someone he actually loved. She held it for a moment, and then told me I had more grace than most people managed in a lifetime. But here's what I learned from that whole experience, the real twist that took me months to understand. Beatrice's test wasn't really about me. It was about her. She had been looking for evidence that good people still existed, that kindness wasn't just a strategy people used when it benefited them. She needed to know that her own failures weren't universal, that someone somewhere was making the choices she wished she had made. And maybe that's what all of us are doing when we test each other. We're looking for proof that the world is better than our worst experiences have taught us to expect. I still work at Hope United. The Sterling donation transformed what we could do, but I made sure it didn't change who we were. Robert Patterson got stable housing and reconnected with his daughter. He volunteers at our office twice a week now, helping other veterans navigate the system that almost destroyed him. Last month, he told me I saved his life. I told him he saved his own life. I just made a few phone calls. But I think about that afternoon in JCPenney all the time. About how close I came to walking past Beatrice. About how the most important moments in our lives often look like minor inconveniences. About how the distance between who we think we are and who we actually are gets measured in split-second choices that nobody else notices. The truth is, I almost failed that test. When I saw the time on my phone and calculated how late I would be, I almost kept walking. The version of me who stopped that day was only barely stronger than the version who would have stepped over her to protect my future with David. That's what keeps me humble. That's what reminds me I'm not better than anyone else. just lucky enough to have made the right choice in the moment that counted. If you're listening to this from somewhere in the world where you're trying to figure out who you want to be, I want you to know something. You're going to be tested. Maybe not the way Beatrice tested me, but tested nonetheless. The world is going to present you with choices between protecting yourself and helping someone else, between being on time and being decent, between looking good and being good. And in those moments, you're going to want to choose the easy path, the safe path, the path that doesn't cost you anything. But I'm asking you to choose differently, not because it will get you rewarded, not because someone is watching and will think better of you, but because the person you become is built from those small choices, one after another, until they add up to something that looks like a life. I'd love to hear from you. Tell me where you're listening from, what city or town or country. Drop a comment and let me know if this story resonated with you, if you've ever had your own JCPenney moment where you had to choose between convenience and conscience. And if you want to hear more stories about the complicated ways people reveal who they really are, make sure you're following along here. Because life is full of tests we don't see coming, and sometimes the only way to pass them is to stop trying to be perfect and start trying to be real. The woman I became started in that department store, but she's still becoming. Every day, every choice, every moment when I have to decide what matters more, the life I planned or the person I actually am. I'm still figuring it out, but at least now I'm figuring it out as myself.